Hello and welcome to Cash and Crises, a series of financial literacy audiographics brought to you by CashEssentials, a private sector initiative with a social mission to support the relief and development community in understanding some lesser-known aspects of how cash is managed for society in times of crisis. Today we'll be taking a look at the role of banknotes in the transmission of communicable diseases such as Ebola and coronavirus. As always, let's start with a short reality check. In June 2014, just as the West Africa Ebola epidemic was gathering momentum, the hospital at the epicenter of the disease at Kenema in Sierra Leone was attacked by an angry mob. Their fear of the disease had been stoked by rumors that banknotes were infected with the virus. Happily, the riot was controlled before those inside were killed, but within hours, stall holders, taxi drivers, and guest house owners started refusing to handle any form of money, even when wearing rubber gloves, and a barter economy took over. Within days, market stalls shut up shop across the country, and it was many months before normal economic activity resumed. Fast forward to earlier this year, when the Global Health Cluster put out a guidance note to international health agencies advocating that, where possible, contactless electronic or mobile payments should be the preferred payment option. Both responses were clearly linked by a single perception that cash is dirty and presents a risk to public health by acting as a vector for the transmission of deadly diseases. But is this true? Were either of these actions based on science? Can banknotes spread disease? The short answer in both cases is no. But there is a longer answer which makes it worthwhile to look at the evidence, or lack of it, that banknotes harbour and transmit viruses and bacteria and the potential risk they pose to public health. A travel advisory at the time of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa from the European Commission's Health Committee in 2014 couldn't have made it any clearer. You cannot contract Ebola by handling money. This statement was based on a broad range of scientific evidence, which overwhelmingly confirms that banknotes do not constitute a specific vector for disease transmission. If they did, says René Gottschalk, head of infectious diseases at the Robert Koch Institute in Germany, the number of cases in any outbreak would be much higher than they are. This is not to suggest that banknotes and coins don't harbour infectious pathogens, such as viruses and bacteria. They do. The Bank of International Settlements clarified what this means in public health terms when it pointed out in a statement in March 2020 that it's not that there is zero risk of disease transmission by banknotes, but that the probability of becoming infected is no higher than with other frequently touched objects, such as debit cards, ATM pin pads, and handrails. The World Health Organization was even more specific when it came out with a similar statement about the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, saying, "We know that cash carries bacteria and viruses, but there is no evidence that it is transmitting COVID-19. So, it seems clear that the problem is not the contaminated surface, but the chain of transmission and what actions we take to disrupt it. In this sense, then, how long pathogens can survive on surfaces, including the surface of a banknote or debit card, is largely irrelevant, as this is not the main mode of transmission for droplet-borne diseases." Yet, with viruses being the causative agent of an estimated 60% of human infections worldwide, it's clear that contaminated surfaces play a role, if only passively, in transmission. Multiple studies have demonstrated that viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites can persist for anything between hours and weeks on a banknote under laboratory conditions. The majority of viruses can also persist for up to 6 days longer on non-porous surfaces such as stainless steel and plastic than on porous ones such as cardboard and cotton. Some, including influenza viruses, can persist for hours or days on banknotes, particularly when diluted in mucus. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the European Central Bank began working closely with European laboratories to assess the behavior of coronaviruses on different surfaces. Early results indicated that they can survive more easily on stainless steel surfaces, e.g. door handles, than on cotton banknotes such as the euro, with survival rates approximately 10 to 100 times higher in the first few hours after contamination. Other analyses indicate that it is much more difficult for a virus to be transferred from porous surfaces, such as cotton banknotes, than from smooth surfaces like plastic. Meanwhile, WHO makes it clear that viruses may persist on surfaces for a few hours or up to several days, but this will vary under different conditions. These conditions are determined not just by the environment, but by the behavioral, biological, physical, and chemical factors involved, all of which affect the survivability and transfer efficiency, the persistence of the pathogen. Physical. Absorptive capacity of the surface. Most cotton-based substrates now use pre- or post-print protective varnishes, which act as surfactants. These extend banknote life and make it difficult for contaminants, including disease pathogens, to remain viable on the surface for long. Adoption of polymer and hybrid notes have also fundamentally altered surface characteristics. It must be assumed that the longer the note is in circulation, the higher the absorptive capacity. Exposure to ultraviolet radiation, sunlight. Ultraviolet radiation is considered a very efficient virucidal process, although resistance to UV exposure varies according to the type of pathogen. Temperature and humidity. According to a meta-study conducted this year in Germany, coronaviruses tend to persist on contaminated surfaces for shorter times at higher temperatures and lower humidities. Chemical. Acidity. The presence of salts and ions within the substrate and on the surface change over time and can alter the pH beyond what is optimal for pathogen survival. Presence of antimicrobials. Most banknotes are manufactured using metallic and/or magnetic inks, some of which have antimicrobial properties. Others, such as Russian rubles, are also treated after printing with antimicrobial fungicides and biocides to prevent the proliferation of mold, bacteria, and viruses. Biological. Presence of other microorganisms. Interaction between different microorganisms may inhibit the potency of different types of pathogen. Organic and inorganic content. The longer cash remains in circulation, the dirtier it becomes. The greater a presence of organic matter, accumulated soil, sweat, and dead skin, the greater the likelihood of a given pathogen persisting. Lower denomination notes, being the most often handled in developing countries, are the most contaminated. Quantity and density of the pathogen. The higher the viral load, the greater their chance to survive and infect a new host organism. Behavioral. Handling frequency including time, pressure, friction. The ability of pathogens to remain viable on banknotes depends on how they were deposited. Exposure. Cash is typically not publicly displayed and is stored in a pocket, purse, or cash box, where it is much less likely to be exposed to settling respiratory droplets when people sneeze or cough. Transmission. Whether the recipient becomes infected or not from touching a banknote depends on the infective dose transferred, which is different for each type of pathogen, the hand hygiene measures taken to disrupt the chain of transmission, and susceptibility. So, what does all this mean in terms of socioeconomic impacts and mitigating the risk of disease transmission? First, banknotes pose no more risk of disease transmission than other everyday objects such as debit cards, ATM pin pads, and handrails. Second, the combination of modern banknote manufacture and improved bulk cash management practices maintain the highest possible quality of currency in circulation. Third, loss of confidence in cash driven by unfounded fears that banknotes act as vectors of disease can foster financial exclusion and slow economic recovery following a pandemic. And finally, policies driven by ideology rather than epidemiology will do further harm by forcing cash payments to be made via electronic means which either don't exist or are not disaster resilient. Alternative payment options are rarely contact-free, and the majority of digital transfers made in low and middle income economies today involve cashing out somewhere in the cycle.
We hope you find these insights useful when considering which cash modality to choose in times of crisis. If you want to know more on this or other related topics covered in our audiographic series, please have a look on our website at www.cashessentials.org. Until next time, goodbye.